Jeff said, my name is Dave Baruti. I'm a technical support specialist in the ordering and e-prescribing group, and I will be guiding us through some more advanced OM rules today. So we'll start off by, I'll basically give a brief, we'll have a brief discussion about the different types of rules that we use in OM. There are three main types. So we'll start by talking about those. We'll move on to where we're actually going to be attaching these rules in OM, and then from there we'll actually hop into the rule dictionary and take a look at a couple different types of rules that we'll create. So let me go ahead and share my screen.
If you have any questions while Dave is presenting, please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A portion of Zoom. Conchetta and I will both be monitoring those.
All right, hopefully everyone can see my screen. If you can't, shoot a chat and we'll try to resolve that. All right, so we're gonna hop into the rule dictionary real quick, just so I can show you guys the categories that we have available. So, as I mentioned a minute ago, we have three main types of rules that we work with in OM, and they correspond to different categories in the rule dictionary. So I go ahead and search for OM. See, we have two that come up first, then there's a third we'll talk about in a minute. First is OM order. So this category of rule corresponds to what we would call conflict rules. They're rules that we would attach to an order or a category. It would evaluate, a certain set of criteria and then determine if the user is going to be brought to a conflict screen or not. To super simplify things, our order type rules can only ever show a conflict screen or not. That's all they can do. So we'll go into more detail about that a little bit later. Our OM print rules are basically going to, similar to, the OM order rules are only going to display a conflict screen or not. The OM print rules will determine if a requisition that's already defined on an order will print or if it won't. So we'll see that a little bit later when I go into the order dictionary. We see where we're going to attach these. That'll make a little bit more sense. And then the last category of rules that we have is called OM, or Order Management All. These rules would be specific to queries and CDSs. So instead of bringing users to a conflict screen or anything like that, these rules will make queries editable or not, required or not, suppressed or not. They can trigger pop-up messages. There are a few different things that we can do with these. These are a little more versatile than the OM order and OM print rules. So if there are no questions, again, we'll go into those in a little more detail when we actually look at the rules. But those are the three main categories that we will ever use in OM. So from here, I'll just close out of the rule dictionary for a moment, and we'll take a look at where we're going to attach these. So we'll start off in the OM category dictionary. In the category dictionary, on the facility tab, we scroll down, we have this section for evaluate at. So our two choices here are the same two choices that we're going to see when we hop into the order dictionary. Choices are evaluate at order or evaluate at save. The difference between these two, evaluating the rule at order, we're basically telling the system when we want the rule logic to kick off and kind of go through and determine if we're going to trigger a conflict screen or not. So evaluate at order would trigger the rule prior to the user entering their PIN and actually trying to file their session. So typically we see sites set these rules up to evaluate at order. Because the other option, evaluate at save, actually won't evaluate and trigger the rule until after the user has entered their PIN and tried to submit. So we'll, like I mentioned, we'll typically see evaluate at order being used just because users typically don't like, entering their PIN, getting all the way to the end, and then getting brought to a conflict screen telling them that they can't place the order that they just tried to PIN. But that's up to your site, I guess, to determine which method you'd like to use. In addition to the evaluate at field, we have the used in orders, used in AM orders field. Those are fairly self-explanatory. It's basically going to mean if the rule that we're attaching is going to be used for orders or AM orders. That would be specific to categories that are being used in both orders and AM orders. Outside of that, all we would do is do a look up here and attach our rule. Now you'll notice all of the rules in the screen right here have a category of OM order. So as I mentioned before, the OM order category, these are going to be our conflict type rules. They will only ever display a conflict screen or not display a conflict screen. Now I'm going to mention it because it says the word rule and it's on the same screen. The connection order rule field that we see here that's grayed out and I can't do anything with, that will basically just show us rules that are attached in the connecting application. So in this case, if there was a rule attached on the lab side, that would be an NPR rule, so completely different than what we're talking about today, we would see that right here. The other place that we can attach rules in the category dictionary would be here on the queries tab. Basically, we have these fields down here: editable rule, required rule, and suppress rule. With these rules, basically they will evaluate as true or false, telling the system to make something editable or not, make something required or not, or suppress something or not. So in order to access these fields, we would actually need to be asking a particular query. So once I ask the specimen query, we see that these are now lit up. We could go ahead and attach a rule there to determine if the specimen field will be editable or not, or required or suppressed. So that should be all for the category dictionary for now. And we will now hop into the order dictionary. All right, so in the order dictionary, let's start on the associations tab. This is going to kind of line up to what we saw on the facility tab in the category dictionary. So if we do a look up here, we have the same exact fields from earlier: evaluate at order or evaluate at save. So again, that's going to function exactly the same as the category dictionary, except in the category dictionary, attaching a rule, that means that would apply to all orders within that category. If we attach the rule in the order dictionary, it will only apply to that one specific order. Outside of that, the fields work the exact same as we described for the category dictionary. Now, if we back up just a bit over to the queries tab, we see we have the same thing here. Again, that will function exactly the same as the category dictionary, except this is specific to this one order as opposed to all orders within the category. Now, the last place that we can attach rules in the order dictionary is on the printing tab. So basically how print rules work, as I mentioned before, we can evaluate all sorts of criteria like, patient's age or location or anything like that, date, time. But at the end of the day, our print rules are only going to evaluate as true or false, basically telling the system it's okay to print a requisition to this destination or it's not okay to print a requisition to this destination. So for that to work, basically what we end up doing is, we pick our output format, we pick the destination, and then we have the print rule field. If we left the print rule field blank, when we place this order, the output format is going to print to the destination. By attaching a print rule, again, it's only going to say, yes, it's okay to print to this destination, or no, it's not okay to print to this destination. So within a print rule, we can't tell the system to send the output format to a particular destination, but rather, we can only say print or don't print. So a lot of times we'll see people try to set up rules where, maybe the pharmacy at the hospital is not open on weekends or something like that. So on weekends, we need requisitions to print somewhere different than they normally would. So to do that, rather than accomplishing that through one print rule and one output format, we would go ahead and add a second output format with the separate location. And then each output format and destination would have its own print rule that would basically be the opposite of each other. They would evaluate the same thing, and one would say it's okay to print while the other one says it's not okay to print, and then vice versa. So you basically would just have to define all of your locations, destinations ahead of time, and then attach your print rules to say, Monday through Friday, it's okay to print here, otherwise it's not. And then, Saturday and Sunday, it's okay to print here, but otherwise it's not. All right, that is all for the order dictionary. So if there are no questions, I'll move on. All right, so far we talked about the category dictionary, where we can attach our OM order or conflict type rules that would then apply to all orders within that category. Then we talked about the order dictionary, where the rules would only apply to that specific order. Now we're going to go even broader and take a look at the OM parameters. So we only have this functionality for ambulatory orders, not for regular orders. But if we scroll down on the AM orders tab, the OM parameters, we see we have this order rule field. And when I do a look up here in the evaluate at field, you see we have a couple other options besides the order and save that we already talked about. So the three additional options that we have here are convert, continue with RX, and dose. So basically, when we attach the rule in the category dictionary, it's going to apply to all orders within that category. When we attach the rule here in the OM parameters, that means that rule will apply and be evaluated on every ambulatory order in the system. That includes ambulatory medications. So that's why we have the additional options here of convert, continue with RX, and dose. So say, for example, we wanted a specific rule to evaluate only within the convert routine. We don't want it to evaluate if the user places, medication order outside of convert. We only want it to evaluate within convert. We could go ahead and select evaluate at convert and then pull in our rule. Other options we have here, continue with RX. Fairly straightforward. That one will only evaluate if a user selects the continue with RX option in convert. So if a user selected to continue a med in convert, the rule would not evaluate. The last extra option that we have is dose, and that would basically evaluate on a dose change of a medication, an ambulatory medication. So one thing to note about this, because I've gotten questions on it before, say for example, we set up the same rule to evaluate at order, evaluate at save, and evaluate at convert. So we have the same rule evaluating at 3 different places. It is possible in that case that you can see the same rule trigger multiple times on the conflict screen. So say if you went into convert, and maybe a better example would be continue with RX. So if we had continue with RX, convert, and save, and we have the same rule attached, and we go into convert, we select continue with RX, and then we try to save the order. If the rule evaluates so as to trigger a conflict screen, we would actually see the same rule show up on that conflict screen 3 times, once for save, once for convert, and once for continue with RX. So that's just something to keep in mind if you need rules to evaluate at multiple points. They have gotten questions on why rules seem to be duplicated on the conflict screen. While we're on this page, we also have this print rule field. Basically, in this one, we're going to pull in a location and then define a print rule for that location that will again determine, if order is meant to be printing to that location, will print or not. All right, so that's all as far as the OM parameters go. So now we're going to hop into the ambulatory drug dictionary. So in the AMP drug dictionary, if we go over to the associations tab, similar to what we had in the order dictionary, see we have this evaluate at field again. If I do a look up here, we're going to see the same options that we just saw in the OM parameters. Again, because the 3 at the end, convert, continue with RX, and dose are specific to ambulatory medications. All right, that's pretty much all we have for the AM drug dictionary. The last place we're going to go is the screen dictionary before we actually hop into the rule dictionary and start talking about the rule build. So basically everything that we've seen so far, we're only attaching our OM order and OM print type rules. Now when we take a look in the screen dictionary, this is where we're going to be attaching our OM or order management all category rules, which are basically going to be, you know, all of our query type rules. So if we take a look on the screen definitions tab of the screen dictionary, you see there are a lot of places on the screen that say the word rule. So starting at the top, we have what's called on-entry and on-exit rules. I'm going to go down to the bottom real quick and point out on-change and on-after-change, because these four rules right here are all very similar in what they do. Basically, you know, with our default, editable, require, and suppress rules, the rule itself is meant to do something specific. When we're talking about on-entry, on-exit, and on-change rules, those rules are we're basically telling the system when to trigger the rule. We're not saying that the rule is doing anything specific, we're just telling it when we want the rule to evaluate. So for example, on-entry and on-exit rules in OM can typically be used for calculations where, say we have a block of queries where, you know, we're answering queries and each response corresponds to a value. And then once all of those queries are filled out, we want a score to default into a block of queries below. On-entry and on-exit basically means upon the user's entry into this block of queries, we're going to trigger the rule, or upon exiting that block of queries. So in the example that I just described, if we go through and we answer 5 queries, we get to the last one, click enter on the keyboard to go into the next block of queries. If we had an on-exit rule attached, as soon as we leave that first block, the rule is going to evaluate, and at that point we could, you know, check the query responses, tally them up, and default a score. Additionally, they could be used for pop-up messages. That's some special functionality that we have with OM category rules that we can't do with OM order or OM print. So again, on entry, on exit will just tell the system when the rule will trigger, but on entry and on exit doesn't necessarily mean the rule is doing something specific. It's just when it's going to trigger. So if we move down here, we now see we have a couple other rules. I'm going to skip default for now, and we'll talk about editable, require, and suppress. So if we do a lookup in the editable field, this is going to be the same for required and suppress. We have options of yes, no, and rule. Obviously, to use a rule here, we would set it to rule, and that would make the next field required. So all of these 3 rules, editable, required, and suppress, these aren't going to say when the rule is going to evaluate, but rather that something specific is going to happen. So do we want the query to be editable or not? Do we want the query to be required or not? Do we want it to be suppressed or not? So as far as these rules go, all we're going to do, no matter what it is we're evaluating, if we're evaluating a different query response, if we're evaluating the patient's age, anything like that, at the end of the day, similar to the conflict screen rules, these we only ever want to evaluate as okay or not okay. And when we think about what those results mean, okay or not okay, we can think about it in terms of, is it okay to make the query editable? Is it okay to require the query? Is it okay to suppress the query? Or is it not okay? So for all of those 3 rules, the rules, we only ever want them to evaluate as okay or not okay. Now, default rules. Default rules are basically used to default a value into a query based on information that we're evaluating. One thing to note about default rules is that they will only evaluate once, and that's going to be whenever you select the direction for your order from the manage order list, or if you already had a default direction for your order. You know, as soon as you select the order, the default rule is going to evaluate, and it will not then reevaluate at any point. So if you're trying to default a query response based on the response to another query, we actually wouldn't want to use a default rule in that case. And that's just because, you know, a user could change a query response, and if we want the default to change based on, you know, a different query, that query would be changed after the user already selected the order and the default rule triggered. So default rules are going to be good for evaluating information that won't change between selecting the order and trying to file the order. So if you want to evaluate, you know, the patient's sex, or, you know, to default a certain value into a query, that would be a good candidate for a default rule. Patient age, location, those are all good for default rules. Query responses or order frequency or dose, those might not be so great for default rules because those are things that a user could change during the ordering session and the rule then would not reevaluate. All right, so skipping below, we have what's called a valid response rule. So valid response rules are going to be specific to a query. When we attach a valid response rule, basically all that is going to do is evaluate the response to that particular query. We'll typically see these used to, you know, generate a pop-up message. So if a user selects a certain response to the query, we can evaluate that and trigger a pop-up message giving the user a warning or giving them additional information. And then, as I mentioned a little earlier, on change rule, similar to on entry and on exit, on change just means the rule is going to evaluate whenever this query is changed. On after change is more or less similar, except that will evaluate, it's basically a timing thing on after the query is changed. So rather than when the query is changed, immediately following the query being changed. We typically mostly see on change rules used though. All right, do we have any questions on screen dictionary rules? All right. So that was basically where pretty much all the places that we would ever be attaching rules as far as OM is concerned. So now I'm going to go ahead and go back into the rule dictionary. And I'm going to pull up the first rule that we're going to be taking a look at today. So this rule is going to be our missing or unsigned admin order rule. Oh, looks like we have a question.
Yep. Is it only the default rule that is evaluated once, or are other rules like this?
No, great question. So default rule is the only one that's going to be evaluated once. Editable rules, require, and suppress rules, since those, we see a lot of sites use those for, you know, based on the response to this query, we want the next query to be suppressed or required. So those kind of need to be in a state of constant, like, reevaluation because we have query responses changing. The on entry, on exit rules, since those will trigger any time you take that action, like enter the block of queries, exit the block of queries, on change rule, if you change the query, those will always evaluate at those times. So default rules are the only ones that are only going to evaluate once and then won't reevaluate. All right. So the first rule we're going to take a look at is an OM order type rule. So again, those are only going to determine if a conflict screen will appear or not. Along with that, we can display a message on the conflict screen. So we'll see that today. So this rule is for a missing or unsigned admission order. So this is a rule that we could attach to the discharge order, and it will check when the user goes to place the discharge order if the patient A has an admin order and B, that admin order has been signed. So let's pull up the rule. And we'll just do a brief rundown of the main tab of the rule dictionary. We have our mnemonic, we have the active flag, we've got the name of the rule. Category of OM order, you'll see that this is grayed out and I can't change that. Basically, our rule categories are going to determine what data fields we're able to use. There are some data fields that can be used in some categories and not in others. So since I already have data fields being used in this rule, the category is grayed out because maybe some of the data fields that I'm using are specific to the OM order category. So it then wouldn't let me change that to something else that maybe doesn't have that data field. We have the mode field, test, or production. We always want to make sure our rules that we're using in a live environment are set to production. Typically, this is more or less a visual indicator for users, but there are instances where having the mode set to test can cause problems. So any rules actually being used in live, we would want to be set to production. Disable flowsheet rule caching, I'm sure Deb mentioned yesterday. That is used in PCS rules, but we don't touch that in OM. The last field we have here, override. This is a yes or no field. This is basically going to determine whether or not this rule will be what we call a hard stop or a soft stop rule. So if the rule triggers to bring the user to a conflict screen, if we have override set to no, or we leave that blank, that means the user is going to get to the conflict screen and they're not going to be able to do anything. They'll just need to back out. They won't be able to place that order for as long as the criteria is met for the rule to trigger. If we have override set to yes, though, we can then pull in an override category. This would basically be the category that houses the different override comments we have available. And that would allow for the override button to be lit up on the conflict screen. So a user could see the conflict screen, see the message, and then decide, I want to go ahead and place the order anyways. They click override, they get the comments from this category, and they can proceed with ordering. One thing to note with this, as far as medication orders are concerned, because we've had instances where people ask, why is my override category not being respected? When we have rules attached to medications, if the rule triggers and we get to the conflict screen and we want to override the conflict, those override comments are actually going to come from pharmacies. So those, we actually won't evaluate what's in the override category field. They'll be specific to our medication override comments. All right, hop over to the variables tab now. So on the variables tab, up at the top we have our variables. New query response is hard-coded. That's always going to be listed there. We're not able to get rid of that. That's always going to default into the dictionary. Besides that, our variable field is free text. You can, for 90% of the time, name your variables whatever you'd like. We typically see people use V1, V2, but you can name them so it's maybe easier to see in the logic what type of value or what you're actually expecting that particular variable to hold. So basically, a good way to think about variables is like a box. You can you have this box and you give the box a name. The contents of the box, however, are going to be different based on different things that we're doing within the rule logic. So we have this external flag that is used in PCS, but again, that's something that we don't use in OM. So we don't really ever want to see that set for any OM rules. And then the description field is just a free text description, so you can say, what you want your variable to hold. That's not going to display anywhere else but in the rule dictionary. So that would really be for people building rules, but not for end users. Then we have our data fields down here. We do a lookup. It will show us all the available data fields that we have for the particular rule category that we selected. And then at the bottom, we have this query lookup. One thing to note about the query lookup, I don't think we actually, we do have a rule later that evaluates queries. But one thing to note with this, any query that we're trying to evaluate within a rule, we actually need that query attached to the same order that the rule is attached to. So if you have a query that's answered maybe in a PCS assessment or something like that, and we want to evaluate that query response on an order, we actually can't do that through here unless that query is also attached to the order. So that's just something to keep in mind. So now, as far as this specific rule is concerned, the unsigned missing admit order rule, there are two data fields that we're using here. The first is OM unsigned admit orders. So this is a data field that specifically keeps track of how many unsigned admit orders exist on a patient. So this is going to work in conjunction with the admission order field in the order dictionary. So if we go over to the general info tab, we see we have this admission order field. So any orders that are set as admission order yes will be taken into consideration for this unsigned admit orders field. So the system itself will keep a tally of how many admission orders have been placed on the patient, how many of those have been signed. So when we're thinking about the logic and what we're actually trying to, oops, clicked the wrong thing. All right, everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Great. All right, so if we're thinking about what we're trying to do in the logic, since this field, this data field keeps a tally of how many unsigned admit orders we have, basically all we want the rule to do is trigger if that number is greater than 0. So a good way to think about rules before we create the logic is just think about in English what we're trying to do, and you'll find that a lot of times it kind of more or less translates over to the actual rule logic that we're entering on the rule tab. So this field will handle our unsigned admit order part, but the missing admit order part, that will come from our OM current order check data field. So this is a data field that works with a specific variable. I mentioned that variables are free text, and 90% of the time you can name them whatever you want. The other 10% of the time, the variables have to have a certain name because they work with specific data fields. So we'll see this a little bit later with our lab results data fields, but for now, the OM current order check data field is one of those fields where we need to have a specific variable defined. That variable is orders, spelled with a capital O, lowercase r-d-e-r. If you try to use the order variable all lowercase or all uppercase, it actually won't work. So that's something to keep in mind. There aren't many data fields that we use commonly that have, these special variables, but OM current order check is one of the big ones. So basically what we do is define this order variable, and then in the rule logic, we're going to be saving our order mnemonic, the order that we want to check for, as this order variable. Besides that, I have one other variable here. I named it results because that's going to hold the what we call the program result of the rule. But again, that one doesn't really matter. That could have been V1, could have been really anything we wanted. So we talked about the two variables we're using. We talked about the two fields that we're using. And now we're going to hop over to the rule tab and actually take a look at the build. So as I mentioned, the first thing that we're doing is saving the mnemonic of the order for which we're checking as the order variable. So when I looked in the order dictionary, we're trying to make sure the patient has an active admit order on them before the physician discharges them. So when I check the dictionary, we see the mnemonic of this order is admit. So I'm going to pull that directly from the order dictionary and use that in my rule. We're saying compute admit, save as order. This is similar to the variable in that it has to be exact. So whatever is in the order dictionary is what we want to use. That'll hold true for our lab orders, our connecting orders that have a .fa, .lab, or .whatever. We want to pull the whole mnemonic as it is in the order dictionary, capitalization and everything. Otherwise, it won't work. So once we do that, the order variable is now holding this mnemonic, and that's going to be used with the current order check data field. Current order check data field is going to evaluate if the order in the order variable exists on the patient or not. So when we talk about that data field, we don't need to check to see if it's equal to anything. We don't need to check if it's greater than anything or within a certain range. All we ever want to do is check, does the current order check exist or does it not exist? Meaning, does the order exist on the current orders table or does it not? This does not work for completed or canceled or discontinued orders unless you have your settings set to keep discontinued orders on the current orders table. Basically, the main point here is that the orders need to be on the current orders table to be evaluated with the current order check. So let's take a look at the logic, then we can run through the actual build of it. One thing that I want to point out, so the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 the first 5 rules we're going to talk about today are all going to be OM order type rules. So even though we're talking about different rules and we have different rule builds and we're using different data fields or evaluating different things, at the end of the day, all of these rules are only going to ever display a conflict screen or not. So to really simplify things, that's really all these rules are doing. We're going to be using different data fields, but what we really want to focus on is the formula that we're using is going to be more or less the exact same for every single rule we're taking a look at today. It's going to be in a format of if this, then we want something to happen. And that something to trigger a conflict screen requires a list if we want a message to display to the user. That list will always follow the same format of not okay. This is going to be our triggering value that tells the system trigger a conflict screen. Second part of the list is our message. And if we have, a second part of the list, that's going to tell the system display this on the conflict screen. So we will always, in cases when we're working with OM order type rules and we want a conflict screen to display with a message, we'll always have a create list, not okay, message, save as a variable, and then we'll set the program result to that variable. So let's take a look at what we're actually doing here. So the first thing we're checking is if the current order check does not exist. So we want to first check, does the patient have an admit order? If they don't, we're going to create our list of not okay in our message. We're going to save that as a variable, and we're going to set the program results to that variable. So at that point, the rule should kind of stop. We would get, if we don't have that order on the current orders table, we'll get the conflict screen and we'll receive this message right here. Then we're going to proceed down to our else if or if line. So if the current order check does exist, we're going to bypass these 2 lines and we're going to come down here and say, okay, well, is the unsigned admit orders count greater than 0? If it is greater than 0, that would mean the patient has at least 1 unsigned admit order on their account. So we're going to follow the same exact steps. The message that we have here is going to be different than this time. This is going to say the patient has an unsigned admit order instead of the patient is missing an admit order. But otherwise, it's the exact same. Create list, not okay. We have our message. Save as result, set program result to result. Otherwise, we're going to set program result to okay. So in all other cases, besides current order check not existing and the unsigned admit order count being greater than 0, we're going to set the program result to okay. Now, one thing that I want to point out while we're here, there are multiple ways to build the exact same rule. There isn't necessarily a right, there are right and wrong ways to build rules, but there are multiple right ways to build rules. So just because we see in this example we have create list, not okay, then a message, doesn't mean we actually always have to hard code the message there. We could potentially, save a message as a variable, and then use the variable. That will be essentially the same thing as what we just did, except we didn't hard code the message there. We did it earlier in a variable. So again, multiple correct ways to build rules. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in this exact format, but to trigger the conflict screen, what we need is a program result that contains a list of not okay and whatever we want to display on the screen. So let's go real quickly through the steps of building this out, and then we will move on. So the first thing we do, we'll start with enter line. In order for the current order check data field to work, we need to compute our mnemonic and save that as the order variable. Do expression, compute expression, go to free text, and type in the mnemonic exactly as it appears in the order dictionary. From there, we'll do save as variable, and we'll select the order variable, and then end line. So our first line is done. That's basically all the setup we needed to do in that case. If we were doing something like evaluating just like the patient's sex or age, we wouldn't need to, do any work before that for any data fields, because OM patient sex and OM patient age are fairly straightforward in that they're just pulling a piece of information on the patient. We don't need to define something additional. So in this case, since we already defined our mnemonic as the order variable, we can now move on to our if statement. So we'll start by doing if field. We'll do the current order check first, because it doesn't necessarily make sense to check for unsigned admit orders if the patient doesn't have an admit order. So we'll check to see if they have one first. So if the OM current order check operator exists, or actually, no, I meant it does not exist. At that point, we don't need to check anything else, so I can select end line. Now we're going to select statement. So we're saying if it doesn't exist, then what do we want to have happen? So we'll do statement, expressions, and this is where we're going to create our list. So we'll do create list. We'll find not okay in the variable lookup, so we'll select not okay. Click free text, type out our message. Patient doesn't have an active admit order. And we're going to save that as a variable. Once we do that, we select end line. Now, at this point, we could either use statement to set the program result of the result there, or we could proceed on and set the program result later, because at this point, if this evaluated as true, meaning the current order check doesn't exist, we're creating this list anyways, and we're saving it as the result variable. So that variable will be holding this list, whether we're setting the result now or a little bit later in the rule. But we're going to go ahead and set the program result now. So once we hit that, we just trigger the conflict screen, and that's it. All right, so at this point, we have one other thing that we want to evaluate. So if they don't have the admit order, we'll trigger the conflict screen and display this message. Or if they do have an admit order, we now want to check to see if it's signed or not. So we'll check if the OM unsigned admit orders count. Remember, this is an internal count system keeps. All we're doing is checking if it's greater than 0. So if the OM unsigned admit orders count is greater than 0, do end line, statement, expressions, and we are going to create a list again. Not okay. Patient has an unsigned admit order. Please review. Save that as variable and set the program result to that variable. Now there's nothing else specific that we want to check. When we do have specific things we want to check, we'll use else if. In this case, we don't care about anything else. If the current order check is there and the unsigned admit orders count is 0, we don't want to trigger a conflict screen. So that way we'll use else. That's basically our catch-all, saying in every other scenario, we're going to set the program result to okay. Select end line. You'll see we have the option to proceed on with a different if statement or add another statement under the otherwise line, but we don't need to do anything else here, so we'll select end if, and then we can save our rule. So as I mentioned, this rule would be attached in the order dictionary to the discharge order on the associations tab. So I go to the associations tab, we'll scroll down. There are 2 other rules attached here that we're going to be taking a look at. But for now, we see we have the unsigned missing admit order rule attached, used in orders, evaluate at order. So let's pull up a patient real quick. Orders tab. And this was a patient that was admitted yesterday. We have an admit as inpatient order. That was the order that we're checking for in the rule. So they do have the order. But if we check the history and take a look at the audit trail, we're going to see that the order was entered, but a signature is necessary. So this order has not yet been signed. So we should see that internal unsigned admit orders count at 1 right now because the order was not signed. So I'm going to select new orders and pretend like we're placing the discharge order. No required info, we'll go ahead. So at this point, I could click submit and we could get the conflict screen. But because we have the rule set to evaluate at order, we don't even need to go that far yet. Because I already selected the order, the rule is kind of already evaluating. So I could click the conflict screen or the conflict tab right here to actually see the conflict. So you see a type of OM rule, description, that's going to pull directly from the name field in the rule dictionary. So we see unsigned missing admit order. And then we have our rule message, the patient has an unsigned admit order, please review. So we'll just go back to the order list. Again, you don't need to directly click the conflict tab. If we click submit, we'll be brought to the same screen. One thing to note here, the override button is grayed out. So if I go back into the rule dictionary and take a look at our order, oh, you know what, did I do wrong? Looks like that might not have crossed after I saved. But basically, when we set the override field to yes, we should see that button available, and we could then proceed with ordering. In this case, none of the rules that we have attached have override set to yes, so we actually can't do anything. I can't click next, I can't submit. All I can do is back out. All right, so while we're on the topic of rules attached to the discharge order and admissions, let's take a look at our next rule, which is going to be the 2 midnight rule. So this rule is basically going to present a conflict at discharge if the patient has not been admitted for at least 2 midnights. So a thing to note with that is that it specifically says 2 midnights, not 48 hours. So we're not checking the time the patient has been admitted in 48 hours. It's literally just 2 calendar days or 2 midnights. So let's pull up the rule. You can see the main tab is very similar. Category of OM ordered, it's grayed out because we have data fields we're already using. Override set to no. Hop over to the variables tab and see what we have here. So we have a couple variables up top, but I'm going to skip those for now. Actually, I think a couple of those we're not even using. No, okay. And we're going to hop down to the data fields that we're using. So how are we going to check to see how long the patient has been admitted for? In order to find that out, we need to know when the patient was admitted and what day it is today and what time it is. So what we're doing, actually we don't need time, I don't need it. We just need the date. So current date, so that MIS current date data field is going to return today's date, and the reg admit date field is going to return the date that the patient was admitted. Now you see up here, I listed out a couple different variables. We have elapsed date. So we would expect by the name of that variable for that to hold how many days have elapsed between 2 dates. We have the result variable that I was using in the other rules to basically hold our list of not okay and the message that we're going to display on the conflict screen. We have a variable of date internal. You'll see what that's for in a minute. And a variable of date list, which we could think of as a list of different dates. So again, these could have been V1, V2, V3, V4. These are all free text. Nothing needs to be defined this way. But in rules like this, where we're using multiple variables, sometimes it's very helpful to name the variable after what value they're going to be holding. So if I go over to the rule tab, let's take a look at what we're doing. So let's skip the first 3 lines for now and look at the last part, because this is going to pretty much be very similar to what we just saw a moment ago, where we're saying if something, then we're going to create our list of not okay, our message, save that as a variable, set program result to that variable. Otherwise, we're going to set the program result to okay. So in this case, all we want to do is check if the patient has been admitted for 2 midnights or not. So if elapsed date is less than 2, then we're going to proceed with the conflict screen. Otherwise, we won't. So to get to this point, though, there's a little bit of setup that we need to do in the first 3 lines of the rule. So the first thing we need to do is take the MIS current date data field, which is saved in an external format. When we talk about dates, dates can be saved in 2 different formats, internal or external. So external, rather, would display exactly how we see here. So today's date, we would see 11/16/17. The internal format of the date would show year, month, day. So to correctly evaluate how much time has passed between 2 dates, we always need the dates in the internal format. Otherwise, the system isn't going to be able to actually calculate that correctly because of the slashes that would be in the external format. So the first thing we do, since the MIS current date data field is in external format, we need to convert that to the internal format. So we'll see how to do that in just a moment. But we're converting that to date internal, and we're going to save that as a variable that we also call date internal. Again, that could have been v1, doesn't matter. I just named it that because that's the values that it's holding. After that, we're going to create a list of our 2 dates, the reg admit date, which that data field is actually already storing the date in an internal format. That's why we don't need to do anything with that. We create our list of reg admit date, and then our date internal variable, which is today's current date in an internal format. And we're going to save that as a new variable called date list. One thing to note about doing this is that we want the date that's furthest in the past to be the first part of the list. So the admit date, that's going to be the one that comes before the current date. So we'll put that as the first one on the list. Then we'll put today's date. So always the furthest out in the past date and then the most current date. So now we have this date list variable that's holding the value reg admit date and our date internal variable, so today's date. Then we're going to use the convert function again to convert that list of dates to what's called date elapsed. So the system will handle all the calculations itself. Say we're going to take the admit date and today's date. We're going to compare the 2, see how many days have passed, and then we're going to save that as this elapsed date variable. At that point, since this is the number that we want, if 3 days have elapsed or 1 or 7, now we can check if that variable is less than 2, and if it is, trigger our conflict screen. So let's take a look at how we're going to build this out. This one is making use of the string manipulation menu that we have here. Now, this is a very interesting little sub menu because string manipulation basically allows us to do different things to values within the rule. We can format them, and by that we can take particular values and convert them to different formats, like we did with taking the date in an external format and converting it to internal. So when we do that, we would select our source. So our source in this case is MIS current date. Select that. I'm going to convert that to date internal. And we're going to save that as a variable that we named date internal. So we'll select end line, and we see we have that line exactly the same as up here. Next thing we want to do, since the admit date, again, is already in an internal format, we don't need to do anything with that. So at this point, all we need to do is create our list. So we'll do create list, field, reg admit date, variable, date internal, and we're going to save that as date list. So say, for example, we did not convert the MIS current date to date internal. And we just created a list of reg admit date and MIS current date. that would leave us with a list that holds values that looks like this. So the system isn't properly going to be able to see how many days have passed between these two dates. So if we're ever, creating a list of dates, trying to find how much time or how many days have passed between the two, they need to be in that same internal format. Otherwise, it actually won't return anything. So we do see that happen frequently. If we're, if sites are building out this rule and forget to add the convert MIS current date to date internal line, the rule won't work properly because we won't have an elapsed date at that point. So it would always be less than 2. We would always trigger the conflict. So the last piece of the setup that we need to do, we took the current date in the external form, converted it to the internal form, and saved it as a variable. We made a list of the admit dates, so the date furthest from today in the past, and then today's date in our variable. Save that as a different variable, date list, and now we're going to take that list, and the system knows when we give it a list of 2 dates in internal format. When we use the string manipulation format function, we can convert that to date elapsed, and the system will take that list and determine how many days have passed and give us that value. So our source of date list, right here, convert to date elapsed, that's going to be in days, and we will save as elapsed date. Then end line. Once that's done, elapsed date has the value that we need, so we can just continue on with our if statement, very similar to what we did in the other one, where we're checking if something, we'll create our list and set the program results. So if the elapsed date operator is less than 2, nothing else we need to do here, so we'll do end line. Statement, expressions, we'll create our list of not okay, and our message. Save that as a variable, select end line. Now we're going to use statement to just set the program result to that variable right there. Once that's done, we want to add our else line. Although it's not really necessary, it's good practice to always use the otherwise line, just so we're telling the system, we're giving the system very clear-cut instructions of what to do in all cases, if the elapsed date is less than 2, or any other scenario besides that. So although it's not technically needed, we do usually want to add our else line. So we'll say else expressions, set program results to okay, end line, and then we can end our if statement. And then we have our rule logic. All right, it doesn't look like there are any questions. So we actually already saw that one trigger. Patient has not been admitted for at least 2 midnights. Please review before proceeding with discharge. As I mentioned, this patient was admitted yesterday. So our elapsed date value in this case should be 1. All right, the next rule we're going to take a look at is for pediatric dose range checking. So I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier. We're looking over different rules today, and we're building them out, and they're all doing kind of different things. But at the end of the day, they're all really just displaying a conflict screen or not. We're going to look at this example for pediatric dose range checking on a children's Motrin order. But really, you can use the concepts that we're using today to kind of tweak this and make it work for really anything you're trying to do as far as checking doses against patient ages or anything like that. So let's pull up this rule. Take a look. Main tab. Same thing we've seen before, except the name is different. Still have the category of OM order because we're dealing with conflict rules to bring us to a conflict screen. Go to the variables tab. this one's fairly straightforward. Basically, what we want to do is present a conflict for patients. If a med dose is greater than a certain value when the patient is between 0 and 6 months old versus if the patient is 6 months to a year old. So really all we need to check here as far as data fields are concerned, the patient's age and the OM med dose. Outside of that, our variable right here, we put that result variable I've been using that we've been using to hold the not okay list with our message. So this one doesn't require any additional setup, like we have no dates we need to convert to anything. All we're doing is checking the patient age and the med dose. You'll see that I'm using a field called OM current patient age. Now, if I do a lookup here for age, select any word, we see we have quite a few. And we have two that specifically reference OM patient age and OM current patient age. We would always recommend that you use the OM current patient age data field because this one is going to basically be the most accurate data field. We will always basically in real time compute what the patient's age is down to the month and day based on the birth date for that patient. Looks like we have a question.
Yes. Is there a document on the PNR page that defines all the commands, string manipulation, why, and what they should be used for?
I think, I know we had a document that was working on the data field. I don't know if we have one specifically for the string manipulation functions, but I can look into that.
I know there is a document, one of the presentations on the PCS PNR page under the rules. It details out what string manipulation does and what each option string manipulation gives.
Thank you, Deb.
No problem.
All right. Take a look again at the age data fields, because the other thing I was going to say, so the current patient age data field, as I mentioned, is going to be based off of the patient's birth date. It will actually compute down to the month and day how old the patient is, 20 years, 4 months, and 3 days. The OM patient age data field, on the other hand, is going to pull the age that was entered in admissions. So this one isn't always going to be completely accurate. There's a lot of times where we'll see the OM patient age field pull an older value or a not quite specific enough value. Whereas current patient age might say the patient is, 11 years and a couple months and a few days. OM patient age would just return 11, or whatever the user manually entered in the age field in admissions. So we always want to recommend using the current patient age field.
We have another question.
Right.
Can you please explain the default queries from screen on the variables tab? I don't know if you're going over that in another rule or. I am not, but I can quickly talk about that. So basically what this would do is say you're using a rule to, as I mentioned earlier with the on entry and on exit, if we were doing calculations where we're taking into account a number of queries and their values, basically all this does is prevent you from having to individually select each query that we want to evaluate. Instead, if we're evaluating queries that are all on the same CDS, we could select default queries from screen and then pick a screen, and all of the queries on that screen will then default into here. So for example, this one probably has a decent number. The clinical data main tab, I click that, all of the queries from that screen are going to default in there, so I don't need to manually add all of them. All right. So yeah, back, let's see, another question. No, just a comment.
Okay, great. All right, so back to the rule. Current patient age, OM med dose, and our variable of result. Let's go to the rule tab. Now, that OM current patient age data field, and we'll see this in a minute while I explain another rule that we can use to check what values data fields are actually holding. Our current patient age data field will store the age in years, month, and days, just like that. So in an example where the patient is 1 year, 2 months, and 3 days old, the age would be saved like this. This is what the patient's age would look like with that current patient age data field. So to evaluate if the patient's age in months is greater than or less than 6, we would evaluate that like this. If we were checking the patient's age in days, say the patient is less than 30 days old, we would evaluate it as that. So again, that's going to be significantly more accurate than the OM patient age field, so we would always recommend using current patient age. So with that said, we jumped right into the if statement because these data fields just pull values. We don't need to define anything. We don't need to, manipulate any values or anything like that. We'll just check them exactly as they are. So if the patient's current age is less than 0.06, we remember that means 6 months, and the OM med dose is greater than 25, then we're going to create our list, not okay. We have our message, saving that as our variable, setting the program result to that variable. Or if the patient age is within the range of 0.06, so 6 months through 1, in this case, I could have done 1.00.00, but it's not really necessary because at that point, all we're checking is, if they're 1 year. If we wanted to check, if they were a year and 6 months, we could do that with 1.06. But in this case, we don't really need to do that. So we're just checking if it's within the range of 6 months through 1 year, and the OM med dose is greater than 50, then we're going to create a different list, not okay, different message, save as our variable, set program result to that variable. Otherwise, we're going to set program results to okay. So we've so far looked at 3 OM order type rules, and hopefully you'll notice that pretty much the formula that we're using is exactly the same. In every single rule we've used so far, we've said if this, then create a list of not okay, message, save as variable, set program result to variable. Then we can add our else if or if line where we'll define something different. Otherwise, set program result to okay. So let's take a quick look at how this would actually work. This one's going to be attached to, as I mentioned, a children's Motrin order. So let's pull up a patient that is 1 month and 9 days old. So I'm going to go into orders. Select new meds. Oops. So select my order, and we'll leave it at 200 for now. So if we look at the rule logic, if the patient age is less than 6 months and the dose is greater than 25, we should get this message. So if dose is greater than 25, patient is less than 6 months, go to submit. And we get our standard dose warning that's unrelated to what we were doing in the rule. And then we get our pediatric dose range check rule. And we have the rule message, dose for patients under 6 months must be less than 25. Now there's one additional rule that we see here. It's called data field check. So this is a rule that we can use to, since there's not really a glossary in the system or anything that kind of explains exactly what each data field is, we actually have a very easy way of being able to see what these data fields are holding. So if I go into the rule dictionary and pull up this data field check rule, this is going to be an OM order type rule. And the logic is going to be super simple. We don't need to evaluate anything. We don't need to have any if statements. All we're trying to do is trigger a conflict screen to display a data field as the message. So in this case, I wanted to see what the OM current patient age data field was holding. So we can go ahead and define that field here. Really any field we want, we could define. But so we go to the rule tab. Again, we don't need to, as I mentioned earlier, whenever we want a conflict screen to display and we want a message to display, we're always going to use these two lines. Create list, not okay, message, save as something, set program result to that something. In this case, we don't need to check an if. All we want to do is see this as our message. So we created our list of not okay. We added a data field, saved it as our variable, set program result to that variable. So that means we now have a rule that will always trigger, and it will display whatever we put here as the message. So instead of a free text message, we put a data field. So when I placed the order, the rule triggered, and instead of a free text message, we got whatever value was in that data field. So in this case, it's telling us the current patient age data field stores the age in years, so 0.month01 corresponds to this, .09 for days. Did we have a question?
It was more of a comment just for the person that was looking for resources on the PCS rules page under dictionaries and concept was what they found helpful. And that's what Conchetta mentioned yesterday and that I showed when we were looking at the PCS project resource homepage.
Perfect. All right. So in this specific example, I used the OM current patient age data field so we could kind of see what that was holding. But this should work, as I mentioned, for pretty much anything. So if you wanted to see, hey, what does the HIM name full data field hold? You can switch that out, and now our rule will display that data field on the conflict screen. So that's a really, really helpful trick that you can use if you're confused about what a particular data field is supposed to be holding. You can even use that for any variables or really anything you're doing in your rule. If you have a rule that's not working properly and you're not sure where it's going wrong, set up the rule like that to basically trigger all the time and display, instead of putting OM current patient age as your message, put one of the variables in your rule to see if it holds the value that you're expecting or not.
So we do have a question. Is it possible to write a rule in OM that instead of going to the conflict screen, it displays a message in a pop-up screen like the message type rule in PCS?
Yes and no. We can't do it with an OM order type rule because the OM order rules will only display a conflict screen or not. We can, however, do that through a rule on a screen. So in screen dictionary, our on entry, on exit, on change, and valid response should be able, and actually default rules even should be able to display pop-up messages. So that would just require you to have a particular query like on your order on the screen, and then we would just attach a rule to that query. So a good example. A good example of that, say you wanted a pop-up message to always display. It doesn't need to evaluate anything. You just always want it to display to users when they select the direction. In that case, you could build what we would call a dummy query. It could just be a comment type query, really anything. You don't need to query for any information. You're just using it as a place to attach a rule to. You could, in that case, write a rule that just says, display the following message, the pop-up message. So we see with the OM category rule, we have this message dialog box option. So if we had a pop-up message that we always wanted to display, we could write the logic similar to this. Again, that's an OM category rule, meaning we need to attach it to a query or a CDS. We could then attach that in the default rule field for our dummy query that we could even have suppressed on the screen so the users don't even need to see it. And that message would pop up whenever we select the direction from the manage order list. Since default rules only evaluate once, you would just get that pop-up once, and then that would be it. But besides that, you can also, use if statements to evaluate things and trigger pop-up messages, but those would need to be attached as, our on entry, on exit, on change, or valid response. All right. No questions for now, so let's move along. We have 1, 2, 3 rules left. So the next one we're going to take a look at is our creatinine clearance rule. So in this one, we are going to talk about pulling lab results on a patient. So let's pull up the rule, main tab, same as before, OM order category. We have override set to no. Take a look at the variables tab. Looking at the fields we have OM last verified result and OM patient sex, and then up at the top we have variables V1, V2, actually if we're not using that, so we can get rid of that, and a variable called lab test. So this is another one of those special variables that needs to be defined a certain way for it to work with a specific data field. In this case, the OM last verified result data field. I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but if I do, actually let me try this. If I do a lookup, we see we have a couple different options as far as these lab results data fields go. We have OM last verified results back time, back date Q, display Q, last result, and last verified result. So when we're talking about these lab result data fields, all of these that we see that start with OM last ver res will all use this lab test variable. Capital L, capital T, lowercase, everything else. Similar to the order variable that we looked at with the current order check, if this was spelled with a capital L-A-B, it wouldn't work. Or if all of it was lowercase, wouldn't work. Needs to be this mixed case. So again, we're going to be doing something similar here, where in the previous example where we saved admit as the order variable to work with the current order check, in this case we're going to be saving a lab test mnemonic as the lab test variable, and that will automatically work with the last verified result data field. So with the last verified result data field, it basically is exactly what it says. It's going to pull the last verified result on the patient. And when I say patient, I mean patient and not account. So that means if the patient was admitted 3 years ago with one medical record number and they had a test resulted in lab, then they don't come back for 3 years and then they're admitted today under the same medical record number, and we have a rule pulling the last verified result of the test that they had done 3 years ago, we would get that result from 3 years ago. So basically I'll talk in a little bit about the other data fields that we can use. But just keep in mind the last verified result will literally be the last verified result, whether that was yesterday or earlier today or years ago, as long as it's still on that patient. The patient at the medical record number level will be pulling those results.
We do have a question.
All right.
How does one determine what variables require a specific data field in order for the rule to function? Example, lab, test, like that.
Yep, so basically there are only a handful that we use. I want to say there's a document, I don't know if it's on the OM PNR page, but there's really only a handful of them that we use. In OM we have, so we have this drug class check any data field that will use a variable drug class. Any of the OM current order checks or order added checks will use that order variable. And any of the lab result data fields will use the lab test variable. Outside of that, there really aren't any others that I can think of off the top of my head that use special variables. Really, it's just going to be lab test, drug class, order, and then there are actually a couple others that go along with these lab data fields that I'll talk about in just a minute. But yeah, I can look to see if we have a document of those few variables and their corresponding data fields. All right, so if there are no questions on the variables and fields that we're using for this particular rule, I'm going to move on to the rule tab and we'll take a look at the logic. So the first thing that we're doing here, similar to the rule where we had the current order check, since this data field, the last verified result, works with this special lab test variable, we're going to set that up beforehand by computing our lab test mnemonic and saving that as the lab test variable. Now, this is different from the OM current order check data field, in that with that one, I said we want the mnemonic exactly as it appears in the order dictionary. In this case, we're checking a value in lab. So instead of using the mnemonic that we have in OM, we're going to use the mnemonic that lab uses for the order. So for example, if I go into the order dictionary and pull up creatinine clearance, we see we have, so this is the test that I would be placing and resulting in lab. So we see the mnemonic in OM is crcl.lab.lab.std. The connection mnemonic is crcl. So typically we want to use the connection mnemonic of the test that would be placing and resulting. Now I say typically because in this case, this was the order that we placed and resulted, and this is the connection mnemonic, but this is the mnemonic that we're using in the rule. So why is that? If we go over to the not the options tab, general info tab, and scroll to the bottom, we see we have these lab profile components. Now this is actually going to be easier to see in lab, so I'm going to go ahead and just pull it up in the lab test dictionary. So we're going to go into labs, and we're going to look for this connection mnemonic. Now this is something that we'd typically want to do whenever we're trying to use one of the lab result data fields, just to confirm that there are not multiple components as part of the test that we're looking for. So if I go into the lab test dictionary, go into enter edit, try that again. All right, well, seems to be some difficulty in launching the lab test dictionary. But basically what we would want to do there we go. We'll put in the connection mnemonic of the order that we're placing in OM. So we do that and the test comes up, so this is the test that we place. But is this actually the specific test that we want to look for? We go to page 5 in the lab test dictionary. This is going to list out if this particular test is a profile that has different components. So in this case, this one order with the mnemonic CRCL, or the connection mnemonic rather, when we place that, it's actually a whole bunch of individual tests. So what we're looking for is the creatinine clearance urine. So we see that that component has a mnemonic of UCRCL. So I'll see this a lot where someone says, you know, I'm placing this test with the mnemonic CRCL in OM. I'm resulting it in lab. I'm checking for CRCL in my rule. So I saved, you know, CRCL as the lab test variable. And it's not returning anything. It's not pulling the result. Usually when I hear that, it's because that particular test is a component of the test that we're using the mnemonic for. So really, this is the value that we're looking for. We want that one. This is the mnemonic of the whole, you know, panel of tests that has all of these, but this particular component is what we want. So in this case, that's the connection mnemonic we're going to be using in the rule. So good practice whenever we're writing rules to check lab results. If you think you have the correct mnemonic, go into lab, pull that mnemonic up, and go to page 5 just to confirm that there's nothing else listed there. If there isn't, so I'm going to go ahead and pull up the UCRCL test. This was the one that was a component of the other one. If I go to page 5, it looks completely different. We don't have any of those mnemonics or anything there because this is the one test. There's no components for this. All right, back to the rule. So we did our one line of setup where we computed the connection mnemonic for that one test. We saved that as the lab test variable, capital L, capital T. And then we move on to our if statement. Again, same formula that we used for the others. This time, we're just going to check the patient's sex against the last verified result. So if patient sex is equal to M and the last verified result is less than 90, we're going to create our list of not okay in our message saying creatinine clearance falls below the normal range for males. Save that as a variable and set the program results to that variable. Or if the last result is less than 80, then we're creating the list again, different message, setting the program result to that variable. Otherwise, we're going to set the program result to okay. So why in the second line did I not say, or if patient sex is equal to female and OM less verified results less than 80? Because we don't really need to do that in this case, because in the first line, we're already checking if the patient sex is equal to male and if the result is less than 90. So in this case, it's already assumed that the patient would not be male. So that should kind of catch everything else. Then otherwise, we're going to set the program result to okay. I'm not going to go through the build steps in this one because the steps are exactly the same as the others. The only difference is I'm selecting patient sex and OM last verified result instead of current order check or something else. So let's take a look in practice how that would work. We have this one attached to our amoxicillin order in the order dictionary. We go to the associations tab, evaluate that order, the rule, creatinine clearance check. So we'll pull up the patient, go to the lab panel just to, oh, this was the wrong patient. So now we'll go to lab panel, and we see that we have a creatinine clearance result of 60, resulted yesterday. So if I go to orders, new meds, search for amoxicillin, check off my order, click submit. So we got some dose warnings, but if we see our OM rule type, we have the rule message, patient's creatinine clearance falls below the normal range for males. So say we had a female patient who had a result that was also less than the value that we have here. We would get the conflict screen on that patient with a different message saying it falls below the normal range for females. So while we're talking about the last verified result data field, as I mentioned before, this particular data field is going to pull whatever the last result was, no matter how far in the past it was. So a lot of times it doesn't make the most sense to use this particular data field because maybe we only want a result from the past 7 days or from the time the patient was admitted. So I'm going to briefly discuss how we could use the other data fields here. Talk about kind of the concepts, so how you could kind of piece these together. Looks like we had a question.
Yes. Is it a risk that last ver result may pull a result from another visit and impact patient plan of care and outcomes? How is this tested and validated? From the plan of care and outcomes portion, this is not, those plan of care and outcomes is on the PCS side, and we can't use a rule like this. We can't look to those data fields. So from the PCS perspective, there's no impact, but from the OM perspective, I guess, what is the impact of it because it's at the medical record level?
I mean, the only impact of using this particular data field is that you could potentially pull a result from a previous visit. So whatever that, if it doesn't make sense to check a result that could potentially be from, a couple months ago, then maybe we would want to use a different data field than OM last verified result. So that's a good segue into the data fields that we could use. So say, for example, we only want to pull a result for the past 3 days. So if I look for the data fields, we have a couple different options here. I'll quickly discuss which ones make the most sense to use. So the first one, I'll talk about is the last verified result back time. So this data field will still use the lab test variable. We're going to save the mnemonic exactly as we did before. The difference here is that we can also define another special variable, the lab hours. So last verified result back time, I can say in my rules, maybe for the first line, we have our mnemonic, save as lab test. Now I want a result from 24 hours in the past. I'm going to save 24 as lab hours. I'll move that up. And now we can use the OM last verified result back time data field. That data field will check for a result within the defined hours. So whatever we defined as lab hours, that data field will only return results from that time period. So in this case, if I change that data field to last verified results back time, we'll only get a result if it was resulted within the past 24 hours. Now, along with that, the OM last verified result data field will only return your result. That's all you would get. So if we tried to do that data field check that I mentioned with the last verified result field, it would display 60 or whatever the last result was. If we tried to do the same thing with the last verified result back time data field and there was a result, instead of just giving us the result, it's going to return the result, the date, and the time that it was resulted all in a list format. So being in a list format, that makes it kind of easy to pull pieces out and say, we're going to take the first part of the list and save that as a variable last result because that'll hold the result. We're going to take the second piece of that list and save that as date because that would be the date that it was resulted. And then we'll take the third piece of the list and save that as variable time because that would be the time that it was resulted. So if you wanted to, you could use those. We're not necessarily going to do it today, but we could use those to generate a very specific message on the conflict screen. So you could even say on the conflict screen, the patient's last result was 60 and it was resulted on November 15th at 13:40 in the afternoon. So that's what our last verified result back time data field returns the result, date, and time it was resulted in a list format and works with the lab test and lab hours variables. We have a question.
Yes. Would you have to add a rule that would display a warning if the patient does not have creatinine clearance available in the last 24 hours?
So we could basically, in that case, say we have 24 hours saved as lab hours. Patient sex is male, and the last verified result back time is less than 90. We don't necessarily need to check if it's greater than or less than anything specific in this case. What you could do is we could say if, actually I just caught the mistake that I made. Instead of saying less than 90, we could just say if the last verified result back time does not exist. So,
Sometimes adding those lines into it. Yeah.
I don't think it'll let me delete 90 because that was it. Okay. All right, there we go. So we could just do if the patient sex is equal to male and the last verified result back time does not exist. Because that would basically say if it doesn't exist, we didn't pull a value, meaning we didn't have a result from that time period. So you could technically, you can display a different message saying, hey, the patient doesn't have a creatinine clearance value within the last 24 hours. So you can kind of tweak that however you want. One thing that I did want to point out, a minute ago I said, and OM lab certified result back time is less than 90. That's actually incorrect because I mentioned it saves the result, the date, and the time in a list format. So in that case, we would actually need to pull the specific result value out of the list. So for that, we would do OM last verified results back time operator. We're going to use this offset operator, and we use that to pull pieces out of a list. So when we're talking about list pieces, we always start counting at 0. So we would say piece 0 would be actually the first part of the list, piece 1 would actually be the second part, and piece 2 would be the third. So we'll say offset 0, save as last result, and that would then hold the result instead of just the list. Because if we're checking to see if a list of a result date and time is less than 90, that's not going to work, because we're not comparing identical values. You know, we're comparing letters and numbers, and that doesn't really make sense. So that's with the last verified results back time data field. The other good one, if we don't need to check in hours, we have last verified result back date. I'd suggest using the back date queue, because again, that one is going to hold values in a list format. Same thing, we'll get the result, we'll get the date, we'll get the time. And the list format just makes it easier to pull specific, parts of the list out. With this one, the only difference is instead of defining lab hours, we're going to define lab days. So if we wanted a result from the past 7 days, we do compute mnemonic, save as our lab test variable, compute 7, save as lab days. Change this to be our new data field, backdate queue, compute last verified results, backdate queue, offset 0, save as last result, and now we can just evaluate that variable, which would hold the result of this particular test if it was resulted within the past 7 days. So real quickly, one other cool thing you could do here, and this is kind of piecing together things that we already talked about today. Say 7 days isn't the greatest because maybe the patient was admitted on a different account. And we only want a value if it was resulted in this particular visit. So how would we do that? Well, we already did a rule earlier today where we compared when the patient was admitted to today to find out how many days they've been admitted for. So we could kind of piece that together with this and create a rule where, let me clear out all the ones that we don't need. So if you remember from earlier, do MIS current date, convert to date internal, save as date internal. We can create our list of reg admit date and our date internal variable, save that as date list, convert date list to date elapsed, save as our date elapsed variable. So now date elapsed would be how many days the patient has been admitted for. So instead of actually saving it as the date elapsed variable in that case, we could have done this instead. Date list, convert to date elapsed, save as variable lab days. And then we could proceed on with the rest of the logic, pulling the value out of the last verified result backdate queue data field. Because in that case, it would pull a result only from the defined number of days, which would change based on how long the patient has been admitted for. All right, looks like we have 2 rules left. So we'll quickly take a look at the next one. This one will be for requiring a statin on discharge. So this is one of the clinical decision support rules that checks a patient problem. If a patient has a particular problem on their problem list, then we can check to see if they have specific medications prescribed on discharge. Still an OM order type rule. Go over to the variables tab. Here, let me just clear out the ones that aren't being used. So here we have variable v1 that we can imagine is probably just going to be holding our not okay and message list that we need in all of these rules if we want a message to display on the conflict screen. And we have a variable called drug class. This one's in mixed case, capital D, capital C. This is another one of those special variables. So I think we pretty much went over all of the special variables today. I don't think there are really any others that we use frequently in OM. But so this drug class variable works specifically with this OM AMP drug class check data field. Similar thing, we're going to compute a mnemonic and save that as this variable. And then this data field will check to see if the patient has any drugs with that in that drug class currently active on their ambulatory orders table. Outside of that data field, we're checking what's called EMR problem rules field. This was a new field introduced with 608 and 6.1 to make things a little easier. Previously, we had a field called EMR problem status that we would have to check. We would have to check if the status of the problem was equal to, acute or chronic or suspected or something like that. To make things easier, in 608 and 6.1, they added this new data field called EMR problem rules field. With this, we have two keys that need to be defined. So what are keys? Keys are basically extra specific information that we need on a data field. Something like patient sex is straightforward. The patient's only going to have one listed sex, so we don't need to define anything else. It's just going to pull that value, and we're good to go. With something like problems, patient problems, we can't just say pull the patient problem because patients could have multiple problems listed. So we're checking for a specific problem. So the key field here, we're defining the mnemonic of the specific problem that we're looking for. So in this case, we added 3 of them. These are all the IMO problem mnemonics for acute myocardial infarction. The second key that we have here, we would always define as any active. So the system will use that and automatically just check if it's any status that would be active. So acute, chronic, suspected, anything would consider as active, the system will do that. So if I were to try to add another one of these, we see these key fields are lit up. I would put my IMO problem mnemonic and then any active. So now this is going to be similar to any of the checks that we do, like the drug class check or the current order check, where all we're doing is checking for the existence of this data field rather than if the data field is equal to something in particular. So the first thing that we're doing is computing the mnemonic of the drug class that we're looking for. So in this case, the statin drug class 24:06.08, save as drug class. And then that's all the setup we need to do, so we can continue on with our if statement. This one extends beyond the screen because we're checking if this problem or that problem exists and the drug class check does not exist. So if the patient has any of the stroke problem or AMI problems listed on their problem list and they don't currently have an active statin on their AMP drug list, then we're going to create our list of not okay in our message, save it as a variable, set the program result to that variable. Otherwise, we'll set the program result to okay. In a lot of the examples, so for example, like the best practice documents, we'll typically list only one IMO problem mnemonic in the rule. So we'll just see if EMR problem rules field, IMO prob any active exists, and AMP drug class check does not exist, then make our list, whatever. But in practice, we see a lot of sites want to account for more than one specific problem just because of how the problems can be entered and how the IMO mnemonics are very specific to the exact problem. So this particular problem has a mnemonic of 3528. However, if I search for this, you'll see that a ton of options come up. And it's likely that all of these each have their own IMO mnemonic. So to be safe, we'll usually see sites try to account for like 5 to 10 of these problems, whatever they think will be most commonly selected. So in this case, we have a couple built into the rule. One important thing to note here, when we're talking about using ORs within a statement, if this problem exists, or this problem exists, or this problem exists, and the drug class check does not exist, we always want to make sure all of the ORs are being evaluated kind of as a whole. Just like as a whole, is it true that one of these exists, or is it not true that one of these exists? So this kind of goes back to probably what, like middle school math and like order of operations and parentheses and that sort of thing, where we want to make sure this, or this, or this is all contained within one large set of parentheses. So we see each individual piece is contained within its own parentheses. So we have parentheses around this bit, we have parentheses around this bit, and we have parentheses around this bit. But what we really want is to evaluate this or this or this as a whole, either true, one of those exists, or false, one of those exists. So after we kind of add those, like if we were going through the steps to add those out, if EMR problem rules field exists, or other EMR problem rules field exists, or other EMR problem rules field exists, and drug class check does not exist. For now, we'll just set program result to not okay. That would not give us a message, but it would still trigger the conflict screen. After we do that, we need to go back in to add parentheses around all of the ORs. Otherwise, it could evaluate it as if this problem exists. If that problem exists, then we could set the program result without even checking the and, because we didn't get there yet. So we'll click this line, select edit, and at that point we see each of these is surrounded by its own parentheses, but we want to capture this whole thing from here to here within a bigger set of parentheses. So to do that, we'd click the first parentheses, select insert, go up to parentheses, and just add a open parentheses, so we see that right here. Then we'd click the last one right before the and, so we kind of group all those together in one. Select insert, parentheses again, close parentheses, end line. The tricky thing is that you can't actually see this on the front end. You need to go into edit to see that. So that's something to keep in mind while you're building these. You would need to go into edit to make sure that you have the parentheses in the right spot. All right, so with that rule built out, this patient we see has the active problem. Nothing in AM orders. They go to place the discharge order. We get our conflict. Statin has not been ordered. Now, if I went ahead and ordered a statin in AM orders and then tried it again, the rule would not trigger because the drug class check part fails, because it would exist in that case. So how that works, this drug class, it's basically going to be checking whatever drug class is associated to the generic of the medication in AM orders. So just to confirm, if you're seeing issues with this, you would find your particular AM drug that you want to check, see what the generic is, go into the generic name dictionary in pharmacy. And then in the generic name dictionary, we would have a drug class field where we'd see the drug classes associated to that generic. All right, we have one more rule. This time, it's going to be an OM category rule, so a little different than what we've seen before. And then we'll open it up for questions. So this next rule is going to evaluate a group response multiple type query. So this is different than, this is something that we could kind of use for anything. You could use it as an editable rule. You could use it as a suppress rule. Basically, the end goal is, let's actually take a look. Let's see how it works first, and then we'll see how it's built. So we have this diet as ordered. in here, we have this diet field. This is a group multiple type query. So what's the difference between a group response query and a group multiple query? Group response query, you do a lookup and you can pick one of a list of predefined responses. Group multiple gives you the option to pull in more than one response. So it's still a group response query, but it gives you the option to add more than one.
We have a question. It was about your statin rule. So the statin rule will not work if the discharge order is put in before the convert routine is done? Yeah, if the patient doesn't have, I mean, not that it wouldn't work, but if you didn't do convert and the patient did not have a statin on their AM drug list, then the rule would trigger. So I guess if in convert, you would be prescribing a statin, you would want to make sure the discharge order is placed after that's done and those decisions are made. Otherwise, it won't be entirely accurate. If the physician was going to prescribe a statin but hadn't yet, in that case, you would get triggered with the rule conflict. Any other questions on the statin rule? I know I kind of blew through that one pretty quickly. All right, doesn't look like it for now. Great. Okay, so as I was saying, with the group multiple queries, we have the ability to select more than one response. So, I can pick all these different things and say, we want a combination of these different diets on the patient. But if I select the low-calorie diet, we'll see I now have this query that just randomly popped up on the screen and is now required. So basically what we did here, group response queries are fairly easy to evaluate in that they're only ever going to hold one response. So you can just evaluate it as it is. With group multiple queries, we're saving these responses in a list format. And it's going to hold a mnemonic of those responses in this list format. So say it's something like, R and FL and EB and LC. It's going to hold that rather than, if it was a regular group response, we're only holding a value just like that. So we actually need to check the list of values when it comes to group multiple queries to evaluate anything. So let me pull up the screen real quick. See, we have our multiple response query block. That was that group multiple query. And then in single response queries, we have this max calories query. You can see I have two rules attached here. I have a require rule and a suppress rule. They're going to use pretty much the same logic except reverse. When one is okay, the other one will be not okay. And when the other one is not okay, the other one will be okay. So basically, that's going to make sure that our query is going to be required and not suppressed, or suppressed and not required. There can be cases where if maybe the rule logic was a little bit off, you can have a case where a query is being suppressed but also required. That would let you file the order, but it would file as incomplete because the query was required and we were missing information. So let's take a look at the two rules that we're using. Group multiple require. So we see this time we have the category of OM, and when we have that, we don't have that override field. That's because we're not triggering conflict screens, so there's nothing to override. On the variables tab, I have a variable GM. Doesn't matter, name it whatever you want. I use GM to stand for group multiple, but again, doesn't matter. And then in the query field, we have the diets query. That's the group multiple query that we're trying to evaluate. So this used to be kind of tricky because basically what we had to do was if you remember earlier when I was talking about the lab result data fields and how we had the list that has the result and the date and the time, and we did offset 0 to pull the first part of that list. That's basically what we had to previously do with group multiple queries. We had to pull an offset for each possible response that could be entered and then check to see if any of those offsets are equal to the value that we're looking for. Now we actually have this fun little operator called exist and list that essentially does all that for us, and we don't need to create a monster rule with 70 different offsets for each potential response. So it's actually fairly straightforward what we're going to do here. We're taking this query, this diet query, we're saving that as a variable.
The reason why we're doing that is because in the next line, when we do convert that variable to group response name, save as that variable. In the source menu here, we actually don't have a query option. So whenever we're trying to convert query responses, we would need to save the query as a variable first and then pick that variable to convert it. The reason why we're doing this is internally, these queries will save group responses not with the name, but rather with a mnemonic that's a combination of the query mnemonic and the actual response mnemonic. Those are typically kind of tricky to evaluate as is because it's not exactly the mnemonic of the group response. So usually we'll see that the best way to do this is to convert those query responses to group response name or group response value or something like that. In this case, we're using name, so we can just check the exact name as it appears in the query. So back to the rule dictionary. After I convert that to group response name, save as GM, that GM variable will now be a list of all of the response names that we've selected on the screen. So in this case, a list of regular, full liquid, diabetic, and low calorie. So now that we have our names all in a nice little list, we'll just say if low calorie, now I free texted that in exactly as it was written as the group response, exists in list GM, then set program result to OK. Otherwise, set program result to not OK. So in this case, OK to require if low calorie was in the list, otherwise it's not OK. Now, if I pull up rule number 2, which was our suppress rule, and we go to the rule tab, so this was our require rule. If low calorie exists in list GM, then set program result to OK. Otherwise, set program result to not OK. When we look at the suppress rule, pretty much the exact same logic, except it's reversed. Now it says if low calorie exists in list GM, then set program result to not OK, meaning it's not OK to suppress it if that result is there or that response is there. Otherwise, set the result to OK. So exact same logic. The only thing we did was switch the position of the OK and not OK. And that then means that whenever we have low calorie listed, this query is going to display and be required. And whenever low calorie is not listed, it will not display and it will not be required. So we used that to evaluate the group multiple query for a require and suppress rule. But you don't need to use it as a require suppress rule. We could have really used that for anything just to evaluate that group multiple type query. So that was more of a learning the concept rather than use this specific rule exactly as demonstrated. But obviously you could use it this way. I believe that's it. Now I actually don't have, we didn't really go over an example of a print rule today, but as I mentioned before, print rules will only ever evaluate as true or false. So the logic that we would use for print rules would be pretty much exactly the same as what we do for our OM order rules, with the exception of the message, because we don't have a conflict screen, we don't need the message. So instead of doing create list, not OK, message, save as, yada yada, we would just do set program result OK or set program result not OK. But outside of that, logic is fairly similar to what we would see with our OM order type rules. So I believe that actually does it for today. So I guess we will open it up for questions.
Feel free to use the Q&A or the chat if you have any final questions, okay? We have one. I know that some orders are able to have a hard stop and not others. How does one determine what orders can have a hard stop rule and which ones cannot?
So they should all, technically, we should be able to add hard stops. It's basically going to be determined by this override field. So let me get out of this rule because that's not picking the OM order rule. With the OM order type rules, we would, set that to yes. And that would basically be a soft stop versus leaving it blank would be a hard stop, and we can't override.
Hard stop on a resuscitation order?
I'm not sure about that. I don't know that I've specifically written a rule to do a hard stop on a resuscitation status order. I could potentially see where, you know, if we're using order-based code status, where that info is kind of like saved in the parameters, so the system knows what order we're specifically using for code status. So there could, I mean, if you've seen that in practice, there definitely could be, you know, the system checking like, oh, this is a code status order. You can't do a hard stop on that. But I haven't personally seen that, and I'm not sure, so I would kind of want to look into that before giving a final answer there. Do we have any follow-up questions on that one, or any other questions?
We had a comment, nice job. We had a previous comment that it seems OM orders are easier to understand than PCS, OM rules are easier than PCS rules. It's definitely, even from my perspective, it's much easier to read the rule and what it's doing from PCS rules. So I tend to agree. I feel like, in my experience, I feel like the attaching is a little bit more confusing for us, and we can't use the query section, and there's all these little things. We appreciate everyone. Since there are no further questions, the session was recorded. Feel free to, I know some of you have already opened tasks yesterday with your PCS specialist, so feel free to use that task if you're looking to get a copy of this, continue to either use that task, or your PCS specialist might be more aware of this anyway, so it would probably be easier if you want to reach out to your PCS specialist to get a copy of today's recording. It does take a little while to convert, so might not be able to get it until tomorrow, but yeah, so we have another comment. Thank you so very much, very helpful. I appreciate everyone joining. This is the first virtual seminar we've done for rules, so we really appreciate all of the feedback and everyone taking the time to come and sit in. All right, well, I hope everyone has a wonderful day, a wonderful weekend, and if I don't speak to all of you, a wonderful Thanksgiving.
All right, thank you guys.